Hi, I'm Charles with East Texas Historical Fencing. Continuing our series on the basics of rapier, now that I have a drilling partner here with me, I'll be able to demonstrate more things like the distance on which we begin to engage with the sword, and things like how we engage with the bind, and how much we should be able to gain, and even what a gain is. So we're going to start off with our distance. Some of the early masters talk about when we're both standing straight up and we extend our swords. My tip hits the bell of his guard, his tip hits the bell of mine, and then we extend with our back foot down into a fencing stance and to a regular guard that we learned earlier, and this is more or less our distance. Now, this is where we begin to jockey for position about who's on what side. We begin that further back when the swords aren't touching, but when the swords are actually touching, this is the distance we want to be. So to rewind for a second, we have to know, where do I want to touch his sword with my sword? Because we know that we have the different parts of the blade, like the weak, the strong, and the mid, and I usually want the weak of his sword to be on the strong of my blade so that I can, bully him and push him around the way that I want. But we have to begin in a neutral position from distance, and we have to know where that is. You notice we both start at about the same spot. If you've ever seen any cutting competitions, there's this concept called the nodal percussion of the blade. When you strike the blade, it vibrates like this, and there's a point where it doesn't vibrate, and that's about right here on my sword. Every sword has this. This is usually the optimal place for cutting through tatami mats, or really any target with a sharp weapon. But for our purposes, it also happens to be what we sometimes lovingly refer to as the sweet spot for where we're going to place one blade on top of another blade. So when I begin to make an engagement with my sword, I want this part of my blade to touch that same part of his blade to make the beginning action. Because what that gets for me is it gives me a lane to where I touch that part of his sword, and if he's in a regular fencing guard, there we go, I touch that part of his sword. As I extend through that part of his sword, and I begin to level my sword, and I stay there, and then I ride down. And it allows my guard to keep myself safe, but it's where I shoot forward. We want to pretend as though when we're on guard, when we shoot forward, it's as though there's some sort of pipe that I have to thread my tip into, and as I get my tip into that pipe, now I'm straight in front of myself, and I want to just move forward like this. As I move forward in this straight line, I don't do any type of angular side-to-side movement up and down, because I have his weak on my strong, and I can rely on my sword to push him out of the way. And I don't have to do anything else. And we just ride forward. So the first thing we're going to look at is how to gain the sword. In the German fencing tradition, there's this concept called the Sprechfenster, or the speaking window. And what that talks about is when I engage in a bind, we are giving each other information by pushing and pulling and leaving and whatever else that we're doing on the blade. And so I want to obtain as much information while giving away as little information as possible. So when we're on guard, the tendency is often to, I want to gain his sword, so I push him out of the way like this. I don't want his sword in my face, so I think I'm going to push him out of the way. The reason we don't want to do that in rapier is because it's so easy for him to just disengage off of this position and continue to maintain the center line. So I instead want to gain his sword in such a way that he doesn't feel like he's in disengage. So what I do is I just simply angle my tip ever so slightly over the top of his sword. And it looks like I almost don't do anything. He doesn't feel any type of action, because if I move forward like this, he can counter thrust and hit me just by extending his arm. But as I extend my tip over the top of his sword just a little bit, I move forward, and now I have the advantage, eventually. What makes the rapier so much different from other weapons is the fact that we have this complex guard. This complex guard acts exactly like a buckler at extension, to where there's this cone of defense all around me. We want our sword guard to act like a buckler. The farther away it is from us, the more of a cone of defense that we create. Because if you can see, when I'm like this, he can extend, and this buckler I have isn't doing anything. But if I were to extend my sword out like this, like towards him, he moves forward, and it moves the sword. As the closer he gets to me, the farther the tip gets away from my face or from my body. And I want that to be the same as when I'm moving forward. So when I move forward with this gaining position, I move forward, and his tip gets farther away from me as I move forward. Notice I can create that relationship essentially from any angle. The relevant information here is the concept of extending my arm at the right time without giving him a lot of information, and then angling my blade into where his opening is. You notice my opponent here prefers a much straighter, higher guard like this. And so the concept of me, as I talked about in an earlier video, the most Italian move possible is to gain and hit in fourth guard. Well, he's shutting that line down for me, which means that it doesn't mean that I can't do what I just did. It just means that when I extend, the angle is going to be somewhere else, or we're going to double. The angle is going to be somewhere else where when I extend, I have to move into a different guard into some other place like that. But it still gives me the ability to keep myself from getting stabbed on the way in. So what we don't want to do is we don't want to shove our opponent out of the way and give them the information. If we talk about tempo for a minute, the act of me pushing him out of the way burns my turn. It burns my tempo. It means that now that I've pushed him out of the way, he reacts to what I do, and it's his turn to do, maybe come forward, maybe to disengage, and then we get to this back and forth. I don't want that to ever happen. So I want to get to the point to where my gain and my attack are near simultaneous, so that when we're just on guard, and I decide I'm going to gain an attack, it's just move forward and hit like this. And notice, I wind to this position because that's where the threat of his sword would be. Because if I stay here, he's going to hit me as well. If he's foolish, we're going to double each other. So I have to instead wind to this position to lock his sword out and keep it out of my way, like this. So even though I begin low in my regular fencing guard, as I move forward like this and keep his sword out of my way. Now, I talked about earlier, we want to maintain that position of when I extend my arm into his target like this, I'm at a point where I am creating a straight line from the top of my shoulder to the end of my sword in this firm-footed attack. If I do this as a lunge, like this, then I want to maintain that line from the end of my foot to the end of the tip of the sword like that. It still has to be a straight line, because a straight line is the strongest angle, the strongest vector here. We don't want any type of curvature around the guard like that, because those things are inherently weak. So some things to remember when doing this. What we don't want to do is we don't want to give away what we're going to do by what we call pumping the arm or moving our feet first. If I intend to lunge when I do this and I coil my hand and I step, then he's just going to extend his sword as I do this and hit me, as he should. So I have to instead extend my sword in such a way that at the time he begins to extend his sword or extend his parry to be able to parry me out of the way, I'm already well onto the weak of his blade with my strong, and my mechanical advantage is near impossible to overcome at that point. I create that relationship by moving my sword first, like this. Even from a firm-footed attack, moving my sword first like this to be able to hit. I don't want to give him any time to react. Now, as I approach the fight, say from this far away, I approach the fight and go immediately, just like that, because I don't want to give him any time to register what's going on. Now, what I'm not saying is that you should just approach your opponent and joust and immediately hit each other. You have to make sure that you maintain that form of blade control. As you get better at gaining the sword, like this, you immediately start, I put my sword up, gain. I put my sword up, gain sword. And I put my sword up, gain. And now we start counter-gaining, and now, he's gained my sword, I've gained his sword. So we start positioning, and then we start fencing, right? But there's going to be a point where you have to become proficient at obtaining that gain immediately. If you don't obtain the gain and you just rush forward, at best you're going to double, but most likely you're probably just going to get stabbed in the face. So you have to learn to identify when you have that gain. So when we move to attack, men and women have a little bit different center of gravity. Men's center of gravity is in the chest, women is normally in the hips. So when we move forward for an attack like this is both true for a lunge and for a firm-footed attack. We want to sink our weight ever so slightly. I'm in a basic fencing stance right here. When I extend my arm, notice I extend my arm and I lean into it ever so slightly. I throw my butt back just a little bit, and then I continue to lean forward in such a way that I lean, and I can be able to lean basically as far as I need to. You should, in theory, be able to extend your arm and lean and place your chest on your kneecap and touch the ground with the flat of your hand like this without having to take a step. This is only possible if you hinge at your hips. If you bend your back like this and you begin to hunch, you can't, because you're bending your spine in such a way that it no longer wants, and you're kind of doing this thing. You don't want to do that. You want this to be as efficient as I extend and move forward as possible. I should be able to hit firm-footed, just put your sword down. I should be able to hit firm-footed attack from here, and let's say take a step back, just a little one. There we go. Even from here, like this, and just a little bit more. And even from here, like this, I should be able to hit firm-footed. That's the very maximum part of my extension. Anything past that, I'll begin to fall down, and that's when I would pass, or that's when I would lunge. So you should be, your lunge range, really your attacking range, is farther away, much farther away than you think that it is. But the only reason any of this will matter is if you get used to extending first with your hand. As you extend, you want this extension forward and to torque your hips, and you want to pop forward. Now, I'm not advocating for popping your elbow and shoulder. I am turning with my hips and extending my arm, and you'll notice my arm, even at extension, is still ever so bent. If I extend all the way, then I can feel those tendons like tightening up in my arm, and I don't want to feel that. You want extension forward over the top, like this. Extension forward over the top, and notice I throw my arm back to give myself balance, because I'm torquing my hips so hard as I move forward that I have to throw my arm back to keep myself from just flopping over and flying over to the side.